First off, let me say that, let me set out some modest comments about what I'm trying to do in this paper. I am someone who studies American foreign policy and international relations, and my particular focus, generally speaking, has been issues that had to do with the Cold War, and more recently have focused on American foreign policy in the Middle East. The idea of looking at emancipation was interesting to me because it gave me an opportunity at looking at the Cold War and decolonization through a slightly different lens than I've looked before, and that is the issue of race. So let me begin by making a few preliminary comments. Then I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to try to do as a political scientist to try to analyze the issue that has to do with American policy. And I'm using the word decolonization broadly here to describe, because the United States really didn't have a whole lot of colonies, but its attitude towards both its allies holding on to colonies and its attitude towards the newly developing world, or third world countries, as we would subsequently call them. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to hold up three things simultaneously that I think are incredibly important. One is the Cold War, the ongoing competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for power and influence throughout the world that developed after World War II. Secondly, the process of decolonization. And then this third issue, the domestic development within the United States of a movement by Black Americans for increasing civil rights. As I have been doing the research and looking at that, one of the things that struck me immediately was the fact that indeed third world nationalists in the 1940s and 1950s regularly equated colonialism with slavery. So the notion of emancipation and letting slaves go and the idea of freeing colonies is, in fact, I think, an interesting and apt one. And the other thing I should say, because I don't know how much you know about the decolonization process, is that, in fact, this process of letting former colonies go amounted to nothing short of what Daniel Philpott has called a revolution in sovereignty. Philpott argues in his book by that title that there have really been two critical revolutions in terms of sovereignty in the world. The first, what amounted to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, when the modern international system came into being. The second is really the expansion in the number of states that developed after World War II and the decolonization process. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this change, in 1945, there were 51 states that were founding members of the United Nations. Between 1960, which is kind of the critical date in all of this, the 1960 is the date that the United Nations passed unanimously a General Assembly resolution which basically encouraged states that held colonies to let them go, that all colonies basically had the right to be free and independent, regardless of whether they were, quote, prepared for self-government. So that is a sort of critical resolution. Between 1960 and 1966, no less than 66 new countries emerged in terms of the international system. So this is truly a revolution in terms of international politics. Now, one of the things that I have thought my colleague Matthew Holden was asking me to do was, in particular, to talk a little bit about what political scientists can say that might shed some light on this idea of emancipation and how we can talk about it usefully. So I have 5 things that I'm going to talk about, and because our time is short, I'm going to go through them very quickly, but you can see they all sort of have a connection with one another. The first is the idea that there is something, at least that some scholars call intermestic politics. And what I mean by this are, I'm going to use this to describe issues that basically cross national boundaries. They have a domestic component to them, but they also have an international component to that. And the intermestic issue that I'm focusing in this paper is the issue of race. And the question of race both domestically, but also the question of racial politics internationally. The second point that I'll be talking about a little bit later on are really, very quickly, some different theoretical approaches to understanding this process of decolonization. And the particular theoretical approach that I want to employ is something called constructivism, which is an approach that argues that ideas that are absolutely critical, the ideas that policymakers hold, are absolutely critical in terms of shaping not only their understanding of the world, but what it is desirable or appropriate for them to do. A third component that I'm going to be talking about is a concept that Joseph Nye has used to describe a new kind of power in international relations, soft power. And this is the idea that instead of states trying to force other states to do what they would rather not do because of the threat of force, or they're trying to bribe them, this is in fact a way of trying to alter their behavior based on either the power of example or the idea of ideological attractiveness. A fourth idea that I want to talk about that connects obviously to the first one is the notion that there are transnational actors in world politics. And again, this is a little bit different than some other approaches to international relations. That emphasize the primacy of states, or almost the total domination of states. Transnational actors are non-state actors that nevertheless cross borders. And as we're going to be talking about it in the discussion here, the transnational actors that I'm particularly interested in are black intellectuals that began to organize and to talk with one another in the 1930s and 1940s about the idea of freeing states that were colonies, and many of these were also involved in civil rights movements at home. And the last point that I want to use in my analysis here is the idea of politics as a two-level game. And here I have to say, I have not had the opportunity to look at this carefully in terms of, I'm not a game theorist anyway, but I want you to think about this as a kind of metaphor of understanding that policymakers are faced simultaneously with two kinds of games that they're playing. One, a domestic political game in which they're involved in trying to obviously win election or re-election or do a variety of other sorts of things, and an international politics game, which also, as it happens, involves the politics of race, but that has to do with the Cold War. So those are the five sorts of things that I hope to talk about today, but I will try to have to do them briefly. Let me now turn to the idea of trying to explain why or how this revolution of decolonization occurred. And I'll start simply by offering what is usually called the realist explanation for this sudden freeing of so many new states in international politics. And I'm going to be giving you a caricature of realism, but it'll cover the basics. The emphasis is on changing power relationships. And a realist simply argues the following sorts of things sufficiently explain the process of decolonization. During World War I and World War II, the great imperial powers, Britain, France, and so forth and so on, were gravely wounded. And so as a result, by 1945, these powers were so weakened that they were no longer able to hold on to their colonies. A second point is that the newly emerging great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were in some sense both anti-colonial powers in their orientation. And so they put pressure on these colonial powers to give up their colonies. And finally, a third part of a realist power explanation would say that at least in some cases, we can talk about the rise of third world power. In other words, the places where in parts of former colonies, these colonies had become sufficiently powerful that they were, in a few cases at least, able to fight and win their own independence, in which case I suppose we're talking about liberation rather than emancipation. Now, the thing is, there are problems with each part of this explanation. And let me just briefly mention, It's ironic, for example, that what are generally considered to be the strongest colonial powers surrendered their colonies first, and the weakest colonial power, Portugal, held on to its colonies the longest. A second point, which I don't have a lot of time to go into, is that in fact during the Cold War, the United States, even though it was anti-colonial in some sense, particularly in the early days of the Cold War, often backed colonial powers because Britain and France were important allies in opposing the Soviet Union. So we did not necessarily put that much pressure on the colonial powers. And the last point to note is that particularly when decolonization reaches its kind of height, right around 1960 and in the early 1960s, those people who have studied the process argue that in fact Britain and France basically surrendered their sovereignty over colonies that hardly were interested in being independent, or for which, let me say, there was very little resistance or struggle. So it seems as if there's something more than power that's going on here in terms of this whole process. So let me suggest an alternative explanation, which is offered by constructivism. And here I'm drawing on the work of Robert Jackson and Daniel Philpott. And they basically make the point that colonialism was always about more than power, that in fact in the 19th century it was seen as a part of the civilizing process, that to be accepted as a member of international society, states had to meet certain tests, and if those states didn't meet those tests, and states like the Ottoman Empire and Japan did in fact qualify and were accepted by European powers. But if states did not, then in fact European colonial powers saw colonialism as in fact an agent of civilization. And this was accepted by treaty and so forth. So in other words, colonialism is in the 19th century an international norm. This begins to change in World War I with the rise of self-determination, the creation of a mandate system during the League of Nations and so forth. And it expands during World War II with the creation of not only the United Nations, but the trusteeship system. But this principle of self-determination, again, it begins to place a different norm in terms of independence, which basically says, you know, that states should become independent because they reflect the will of the people who are governing them. And I have a quotation from Sukarno, the leader of the Indonesian independence movement. I won't quote it directly, but it goes something like this. This is right at the end of World War II. Sukarno says, is liberty and independence just for some people and not for others? How is our situation in Indonesia any different? The Dutch, during World War II, claimed that the German occupation of the Netherlands was unjust and, you know, illegitimate and so forth and so on. How is our situation in Indonesia being ruled by people who are there just because of force? How is our situation any different? And that turns out to be a powerful argument. Added to that, so you have a change in international norms, is what I'm suggesting. Added to that, as a result of the fight against Nazism during World War II, is the Allied powers are forced in some sense to articulate a different set of views about racial, racial hierarchy, and to support a more egalitarian idea of racism. And this turns out to be, again, a kind of significant idea. Added to this, not so much third world power as the realists would have it, but as the rise of third world nationalism, this idea, this understanding among peoples in colonial states that they, in fact, should have the right to choose their own rulers, their own form of government and independence. And lastly, Philpott, in particular, as he's analyzing British decolonization, says that the British, in particular, emerged from World War II with a kind of idealism about their colonies. It's interesting because this included parts of the Labour Party as well as parts of the Conservative Party. That, Churchill had always talked about the importance of holding on to empire. So they talked about the idea of modernizing imperialism, about the idea, again, of the empire as a means of developing the colonies and the people that they controlled. But if that's your premise, if that's your justification for empire, when you run smack dab into third world nationalism, and when it becomes clear during the 1950s that the British are going to have to fight to hold on to their colonies, Philpott argues that this is a blow to England's, quote, social reputation that British policymakers like Harold Macmillan are unwilling to sustain. Okay, so that's sort of that's the ideas argument for decolonization. But in my analysis, I particularly want to focus on this idea of changing racial attitudes and changing politics. But let me make one final point before I begin to talk about American foreign policy in all of this. And that is simply to re-emphasize the idea that the Cold War that we're looking at here can be seen as two different elements. One, it is obviously was a struggle for power between these two very powerful countries and had all of the military security components that we associate with those kind of developments. But secondly, the Cold War was also an ideological struggle, an ideological competition. And this is where the idea of soft power obviously comes in, I think, in a very sort of powerful way. And as I was thinking about this, because, again, this is the part about this talk that I know the most about, what struck me was that in the famous X article of George F. Kennan, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, that was published in Foreign Affairs magazine, where he issued the famous containment idea. At the very end of that article, Kennan goes on at some length about how the Cold War is in fact a challenge to American society to deal with a host of problems that basically all societies have to deal with. Questions that have to do with economic growth, but urbanization, and we would add our own sorts of things. But what I guess I'd like you to see there could be nothing more important at a time period when we have emerging countries, most of the world is non-white, and they're looking at the United States and they're asking questions about how, in fact, the United States is dealing with the issue of being a multiracial society. So that's sort of my stepping off point for the last point that I want to talk about here, which is simply to try to connect these things together, and I'll try to do them as quickly as I can here. First, let me just say that I have been so impressed by the historians whose work that I've read. So let me just give you a verbal footnote. Any of you who care to look at the paper on the website, there are three historians whose work was particularly important to me. One is Thomas Borstelmann, whose book, The Cold War and the Color Line. The other, Mary Dudziak, whose book is called Cold War Civil Rights. And a third, Penny von Eschen, whose work is called Race and Empire. These people really provide the foundation for what I'm going to say at the very last part here. So let me first start out by talking a little bit about the Truman presidency, the Eisenhower presidency, and the Kennedy presidency, and then wrap this up. What strikes me about the sort of the very early days of the post-World War II period is that this is a time period in which, at least according to Penny von Eschen, you had this transnational group of black intellectuals who, during World War II, if not before then, she mentions people like W.B. Du Bois. I don't know whether Paul Robeson would be quite in the same category, but certainly an important leader. These people were, she argues, following a policy called PanAfricanism. in which they suggested that the plight and fate of black people around the world was closely interconnected with one another. And that, in other words, if black Americans, for example, wanted to make improvements in civil rights, that was importantly linked to the freeing of African colonies. So there's a kind of tightly connected idea there. And this becomes sort of one strand, it seems to me, of thinking by black intellectuals, and as I say, is an example of the notion of transnational actors. Another thing that is striking about black civil rights activists during this time that I think is absolutely remarkable, in 1947, a number of black intellectuals in the United States actually appealed to the United Nations Human Rights Commission that their government is engaging in discriminatory activity, and one of them alleges that, in fact, the United States is conducting a policy nothing short of genocide. So here's an example of the way in which, a domestic group is using this international forum to publicize their displeasure with the American government. But the most significant thing that emerges out of this period, to me at any rate, is looking at the Truman administration. If you think about it in terms of the twofold chessboard that I talked about earlier, the analyst suggests that while Truman obviously thought the Cold War was the most critical foreign policy issue, domestically he realized in a very powerful way that black voters were very important to him, or could be very important to him. And he was prepared to go ahead with a series of civil rights reforms that did not require congressional support, because there was no support for that. And that included the permanent establishment of something called the Federal Employment Practices Commission, and most famously, as many of you probably know, by executive order, the integration of the military in 1948. The Democratic Party in 1948 adopted, for the time, a quite liberal platform on civil rights. This led to a walkout by Southern Democrats who ran Strom Thurmond for the presidency. But nevertheless, Truman, of course, won famously in 1948, and according to Penny von Eschen, got 70% of the black vote. Okay? So, in other words, the argument here is that on these two chessboards, Truman is choosing to emphasize the importance of trying to do some things domestically and basically internationally, focusing on the Cold War. I'll skip over some things. I'll just make one last point before I go on. The other person that's interestingly involved in playing this kind of two-level game is Walter White, who was head of the NAACP at that time. And White begins to emerge as is the leader of a different movement. I mentioned the Pan-African idea, the notion that, in fact, the fates of blacks were connected. But Penny von Eschen says that basically White entered into a kind of strategic deal with Truman, that he would not criticize Truman's Cold War foreign policy if Truman would commit to following domestic policies that involved reforms for African Americans at home, to the extent that he could do so. And as a consequence, White agreed to go upon a State Department round-the-world tour in 1950, at which he, became, in effect, an advocate for American foreign policy and treatment of blacks to the third world countries. Let me turn briefly to the others. I'm sorry, I'm going. I'll just make a couple of points about the Eisenhower administration. Perhaps the most noted achievement was not so much the president's achievement, but was the Brown versus Board decision in 1954 by the Supreme Court to desegregate the public schools. I have an American diplomat in Africa stated at the time that this was the greatest thing since the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is an example of the kind of soft power that I was talking about. And in the lead up to the Brown versus Board of Education, I think one of the striking things, even though the Eisenhower administration was in office when this happened, the court cases that made their way up to this were actually begun under the Truman administration. And who is it who turns out to write a friend of the court brief on support of this desegregation of public schools? None other than Dean Acheson, the American Secretary of State. Okay. Borstelmann is very interesting in his talk about Eisenhower and sort of tries to pair domestic and international activities which sort of reflect important developments during Eisenhower. His general sense is that unlike Truman, Eisenhower has very little concern about domestic civil rights issues, and that he's sort of compelled by the logic of the Cold War to begin to pay more attention to questions of decolonization and supporting third world countries. So he pairs two events that I'll just mention to you before going on to my last person, Kennedy, and that is the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Little Rock Crisis of 1957. In both of those cases, Eisenhower ends up, if not using force, then intervening. In the case of Suez, for those of you who don't know it, he basically threatens and compels Britain and France and Israel to stop their attack on Egypt and attempt to retake the Suez Canal. So he's attacking Cold War allies to protect a newly important third world country, Egypt. Just as at home in 1957, even though, frankly, he was not a big supporter of Brown versus Board of Education, he finds himself compelled to send troops to Little Rock because Governor Faubus is trying to stop the desegregation of public schools there and basically flaunting a federal court order. Now let me now turn finally to Kennedy. I've talked about the chessboards game. One of the things that's striking is that at least some people who have written about Kennedy argued that even before he became president, he was playing this kind of dual chessboard game. Richard Mahoney, who's written about Kennedy's policy in Africa, said Kennedy, as a Democrat, didn't want to antagonize Southern whites. So Mahoney says he campaigned for black votes by demonstrating the importance of Africa in the terms of the Cold War. In other words, that he would talk about the importance of giving aid to Africa, sending Peace Corps volunteers, and so forth and so on. Let me, because our time is short, mention just one point that I'll say is significant. There is another way in which sort of these chessboards gets joined, and that is African diplomats coming to the United States either to participate in the United Nations or to come to Washington, D.C. And apparently before the interstate system, black diplomats from African countries would often travel on highways between New York City and Washington, D.C. And one of the states that they would go through was Maryland. And there was a famous case in 1961 at which an African diplomat was refused service in a diner in Maryland. This was not the only case, but it's a case that Borstelmann cites. And you'll pardon me for using language that obviously, is not appropriate, but he quotes the waitress at the diner as basically saying, "How was I supposed to know this nigger was a diplomat?" And so, it leads to things like, again, an American Secretary of State going before the state of Maryland's legislature to try to convince them to change their accommodation laws, and basically argues that this is an embarrassment to the United States. Well, conclusion. It really struck me as I was doing this work, the way in which, racial politics at home affected foreign policy, the way in which, in some sense, this came back from overseas, affected American civil rights at home. The other thing is I've studied the UN over the years, but, what struck me in this case, the significance of the UN as a creator of international norms, as a place where third world countries like India could talk about the problem of racism and colonialism. And then we have the issue that I've already mentioned of diplomats assigned to the United Nations who basically, face these kind of discriminations and so forth. And lastly, to say again, I think it struck me that in terms of the role of soft power, that this is a really interesting and important way at looking at the Cold War, which illuminates why it is that civil rights became such an important issue in terms of American foreign policy. Thank you very much.